Thank you. So my name's Jonathan Clark. Thanks to Jody, we've been able to run seriously seminars for many years now, about 10 years or more, I guess, I'm not quite sure. Last week we had Kristen Wood here. I think she's here tonight listening, and she made us all into quantum physicists. She gave strong evidence indicating that it is very likely from the evidence that this universe has been put together with such fine tuning that if you looked at it with an open mind, it looks like it's been created by God. I gave a talk last week after Kristen, and we were looking at Babylonian myths, and we were comparing the Babylonian myths with the history in Genesis. And really we came up with three things there about how it's obvious that the myths in Babylon are very different to the way Genesis reads. There isn't a correlation. We saw that the evidence is that Moses wrote it. The supposed evidence that the Old Testament books and accounts in Genesis came from Babylon was unfounded. We looked at the evidence they used in the Bible, and we saw that that was very unreasonable to try and use evidence within the Bible to say it came from Babylon myth. And so that was a little bit about what we covered last week. So we've had Ron teach us all how to become geologists and geomorphologists. I'm going to be speaking about death and dying. And so we're going to talk about not such fun things. I guess Ron was talking about death and dying of fossils. I'm going to be talking about death and dying of humans. Some of you know that I've written a book, Echoes of Jesus, that is published in Russian. My wife is kindly helping to sell the book at the back there. It's been addressed for non-Christian people to be able to enjoy and appreciate, even if they don't know anything about Jesus or have a love for him. So I hope you consider that book seriously. So, why is there human death? I remember when I was 21, a friend of mine had killed himself, and the news came to me when I was in a laboratory, and I was taken aback by how emotional I was. You know, I thought I'd just get through the day okay, but I was a mess. I'm not someone who would cry, but I fell apart with tears, thinking about my friend who was my age having killed himself. I knew he was in a dark place, but it came as a shock. Many of us have experienced the death of either parents or loved ones or children. It's quite a common experience, of course. We don't have much to do with it much these days. It tends to happen in a hospital or somewhere away from us. I remember seeing for the first time how being accustomed to death can make you a little bit nonchalant about it. I remember holding the hands of an uncle as he breathed his last in the hospital. And I didn't know what to do. He was in hospital and he just died. And my wife was with me, and I thought, well, I better go and tell the doctor at the very least. The guy's just stopped breathing. And I went to the doctor, and he was busy writing notes. And I knocked on the door. I said, need to let you know that Daryl's died. He goes, oh, okay. And just kept on writing notes. So I was thinking, wow, some people can get accustomed to death, can't they? And it doesn't matter how much you feel that you are going to be in control, it's not something you can easily control. I was with a patient, and my receptionist said, you've got to take this phone call. And I took the phone call, and I was being told by one of my sisters, Mum had just died. And I thought, oh, well, I'm in the middle of treating this guy, you know, I can finish this. I couldn't. In other words, death is profound, it's strong, it's powerful. If you've not experienced the death of someone close to you, it might seem that, well, you know, that it's not like that, but it is. It is a very, very tangibly grief-filled moment. So we're going to talk about death. Part of it is, of course, people say, well, you Christians, you talk about a perfect God who made a perfect world. What's so good about God if he made it that right from the very beginning we were meant to die? And for those people who have had experience of the death of loved ones or those around them, that's not just an academic question. It's both an academic question and a question of emotions, isn't it? And it needs to be addressed on both levels accordingly to what they're actually asking for. So non-Christians who believe in evolution, if you were to ask them, why is there death? They would find that an absurd question. Of course, in evolutionary beliefs, there's always been death. Right from the very first time supposedly a life form came into existence by itself, it died. It's just so fortunate for us that it supposedly became something else. Went from pond scum eventually to parrots and eventually to poets. But all along the line, there was lots and lots of death. So there's one guy who put this into context in a very interesting way. He's William B. Praveen, Dr. William B. Praveen. I'm a little bit ahead of myself. That's a photo I took in Russia. Some parts of the world, death has been on large scales in very recent decades. And I know some of you here or some of you listening, you may have come from countries where there has been a lot of death and bombing around you as well. So in Australia, we're a bit immune to large scale and traumatic death in a big societal point of view. Hey, there we go. So this is what this guy wrote. He goes, there are no gods, no purposes. There is no life after death. There is no ultimate foundation to ethics. There is no meaning to life. There is no free will for humans either. So that's William B. Praveen. What gives him some credibility for saying all that? Well, he was a professor of the history of biological sciences. He's actually dead now. He died at about the age of 73. He actually won the inaugural David L. Hull Prize for the International Society for History, Philosophy and Social Studies of Biology. He was a very prominent, outspoken fellow, but that's how he conceptualises death. It just is part of everything around us, and it's silly to ask about what is death about, because there is no purpose in life anyhow, nothing whatsoever. You're just chemistry, and every decision you make is just based on the laws of physics and chemistry. So, as Christians though, we come across a very different picture. So we're going to look at, well, how do we know what God's intention was when he first made the world? Well, one way to look is to look at who was the creator. And as Ron said in Colossians 1 verse 16, we're given a description of who the creator is. For by him being Jesus Christ, all things were created, in heaven, on earth, visible, invisible, whether thrones, powers, rulers or authorities, all things were created by him being Jesus Christ, and for him. So what does that tell us about him if he's a creator? Well, we can then look at Jesus' life on earth and to see how he responded to death. In John chapter 11 verse 35, it's the shortest verse in the Bible. It says Jesus wept. Why did he cry? I remember puzzling over this decades ago. His friend Lazarus had died, and you'd say, well, that's why he cried. But Jesus knew he was going to bring him back to life again. Not back to life to live forever, but back to life. Lazarus was a stinking, rotting corpse who'd been dead for 4 days, but Jesus is there crying. And I posit it to you, I suggest to you, the reason why he is crying is it's that confrontation with reality that this is something that's not meant to be. How else can we see whether death was part and parcel of the world that God made? Well, we can go to Genesis. So in Genesis chapter 2 verse 17, we read about God the Creator talking to our first parents, Adam and Eve. And he gives them a warning. He says, you should not eat from the tree of good and evil, for in that day you eat of it, you will surely die. So it's pretty obvious what he's saying, isn't it? When we read our Bibles, they sometimes do the courtesy of translating idioms into not an idiom in our language, because it wouldn't make sense. So if I said to you in Russian, no flies on my back, you'd say, what are you talking about, flies on your back? Or if I said, she'll be apples, there'd be no point putting that into Russian, because they'll go, who's the woman and where are the apples? And why is a woman like an apple? To be reasonable, when we come across an idiom, we put it into words that have the same intended meaning. So when it says that, when God said to Adam and Eve, when you eat that fruit from the tree of good and evil, you will surely die. The surely die is Hebrew for an expression that really says, in dying you shall die. So it is true that our translations are perfect. In dying you shall die is a way of emphasising the certainty of something happening. But it doesn't emphasise when it's going to happen. So if you flip through from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus to Numbers, Numbers chapter 26, verse 65, Numbers chapter 26, verse 65, you'll see that same expression. But what's fascinating is God's talking and he's explaining how the people had been wandering around in the desert for 40 years, and he had told them that that's what they would have to do. And he said, past tense, they would surely die. In dying they shall die. That's what he told them 40 years earlier. But they didn't die straight away, did they? It took 40 years of wandering around in the desert. So there's an example of that idiom meaning certainty, but not instantaneously. Not instantaneously. So there's obviously something there about death. And then the picture accelerates because Adam and Eve, as you know, they disobey God. And in Genesis 3 verse 17, God now punishes them. We use the word curse. And he says to them, from dust you came, to dust you will return. So that's pretty straightforward language. He created Adam from dust, didn't create him from another animal life form, and when we die, well, you're going to turn back into dirt because that's where you came from. So that's in Genesis 3 verse 19. And verse 22, it's like the icing on the cake in terms of explaining that this is physical death that God's talking about. Of course, he says that he's going to ban Adam and Eve from the garden with the tree of life, lest they will live forever. So Genesis makes it pretty clear that death was not something intentional in the world before God created it. We see this carried through into the New Testament. So if you go to that part of the Bible that deals with Jesus and beyond, there's a book there, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 26. It says that the last enemy to be destroyed is death. I like that picture a lot, actually. You'll see it in my talks every now and again. I used to love a band called the Blue Oyster Cult, and they sang a version of a song called Don't Fear the Reaper. And I said, I could sing that. I don't fear the Reaper. I wanted my friends to know they didn't need to fear the Reaper. That's a figure of death, of course. So 1 Corinthians 15 verse 26 says that the last enemy to be destroyed is death. It wouldn't make much sense that God is going to destroy death in the future if he'd already planned that the world was full of human death right from the get-go. Why would it be an enemy? In fact, when you read 1 Corinthians 15 as a chapter, it falls through in a very coherent story. Verse 3 and 4 talks about Jesus being dead and buried. He's a goner. Verses 4 to 11, it talks about Jesus resurrecting. He comes back to life bodily, not as Casper the Ghost. And don't worry, I didn't bring any ghost-like masks today. He didn't come back as Casper the Ghost. He came back bodily renewed, not like Lazarus's body that was destined to die again, but a perfect new body. And so in Genesis, 1 Corinthians 15, it talks about in verses 4 to 11, Jesus is resurrected and he reappears. And then comes the clinger. The clinger, the big kick. So Jesus is described as coming out of the grave as the first fruits. So I think, he obviously means coming out of the grave. The grave gives a harvest, it gives fruit. This fruit he's referring to is the bodily resurrection of Jesus, isn't it? He's the first example of what it's going to be like for all of us that love Jesus, that have asked him for forgiveness. We're also one day going to come out of the grave in a body like Jesus. He is the first fruits. He's the first example. It's pretty exciting. So it's in that context that we then come up to verse 24, 25, where it talks about how Jesus is going to come back again, and this order is going to disappear. And it's in that context that this order, in other words, this requirement for us to die, is going to finish. In other words, for eternity, Jesus isn't going to have to resurrect people that die all the time, because there's going to be a time when we're not going to die. That's the new world. It's fascinating to see how prevalent this idea is that death was not from the original. You'll see it in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 3, verse 21. It talks about Jesus coming back again and he's going to restore everything. Well, who wants it to be restored if human death was there from the get-go, from the very start? I certainly don't want it to be restored. It just looks the same. And then we see that in Revelations 21, verse 4, and it talks about how in the new world, in our new bodies, there'll be no more crying, no more mourning, there'll be no more death. So it seems pretty obvious, but unfortunately there are still people who say the Bible doesn't paint this picture. But just to put the icing on the cake for you, I guess, is that theologians, people who study the Bible over the centuries, have understood the clear meaning. So Basil of Caesarea, he was born in 330. He speaks very clearly how God made us to live forever. That was the original plan. And then if you go forward about 1,000 years to Thomas Aquinas, he was born in about 1225 or so, he also said the same thing. Come forward again to Martin Luther. Some of you will know these names as names of people who are behind big church organisations and beliefs today. Martin Luther said the same thing. He was born in about 1480s. And then, of course, we got Calvin, a Frenchman, born about early 1500s, and finally John Wesley in the 1700s. So there's just a snapshot of how obvious this message is, that God didn't intend this to be the way it is that we see today. Now, this is vitally important. So when someone says to you in their heartache, why is there death? Why do you talk and praise and love this God when he made this world full of death? If it's appropriate, if they're not just venting their emotions, but if this is a mind question as well, then if it's appropriate, you can say, well, that's not the way it was originally made. God made this world so that we wouldn't die. We disobeyed, and now we've been punished. Now, some people may not like the form of the punishment, but that's now a different subject, isn't it? It's a different conversation. It's a conversation about whether God's fair. And I would ask you, do you think that you would be a better judge of what's fair or not?